Hello, welcome to the second season of the Digital Rights Africa podcast, where we talk about everything on data governance, data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property issues in Africa. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ololade Shyllon, who is the head privacy policy for Africa, Middle East, and Turkey for Meta. Dr. Ololade, welcome to the Digital Rights Africa podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I just really want to have a discussion with you about data protection and privacy in Africa. You have been working in this space for some time. And I just want to get your views around what you think about data protection and privacy in Africa. Are we really ready for this?
I'm not sure if it's an issue of being ready. The world is at a point where whether or not you're ready, data protection is a key issue, literally across the world, right? And in Africa, I think we've been slowly getting there. The landscape is very nascent, although we had, I think, the first law as far back as 2002. But I would say in the last 2-3 years, we've seen a rapid, rate of adoption of laws, and a lot of more regulators are coming on board and trying to enforce the laws, and also, of course, collaborating with the industry and other stakeholders. So we're not there yet. It's not an issue of being ready, because ready or not, it's here. But yeah, there's been a lot of, I would say, acceleration in data protection on the continent in the last couple of years. So
we are here on the fringes of the Data Protection Africa Summit. And just earlier today, we had this conversation about enforcement, compliance, and all of that. So if you're saying ready or not, we are in the state and we have to do something about it. How do we get there? Because even from some of the things that we heard earlier, we are challenged, even with the countries that have data protection laws and the ability to ensure compliance and enforce. So how can we make sure that, we're not just, we're not just jumping ship, but we are in and are going to make the best of what we have.
Yeah. A lot of times people tend to compare the progress we've made as a continent to other regions, for example, like Europe. And I think they don't realize that Europe has had a lot of time to sort of, not necessarily get it right, but at least to start to learn and to sort of iterate on their approach. And we, like I said, are literally new comers or new kids on the block, so to speak. So we have to be given that,
Chance.
Time. The room to not to feel that pressure, to automatically have a law and start to implement. Like it's a process, and it takes time to get there. Of course, with others that have gone ahead of us, there's room to learn from them. But the reality is that I'm not saying data protection is, relative to what region you're from, but there are some nuances that I think, we'll have in the region, that it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to just borrow, as we're learning, cut and paste and just adopt the same way, but learn and see how we can adapt, within the region. That said, I think there are some very unique challenges we face as a region.
Exactly.
And some of them were discussed earlier. Basic things like, I would say political will, which then seeps into things like technical and financial resources for implementation and enforcement, to issues around independence of institutions. So some of them are related to the frameworks themselves, while others are related to the actual implementation of the frameworks. So there's challenges that I believe that we need to face. But I think other regions also probably face this and have probably found ways over time to sort of address them.
So
moving forward.
you have worked in this space for some time, and I know that you're really familiar with the challenges. Is there a way around addressing these challenges? I know I'm asking a tough question because there are many African countries with data, and the problems that they face, varies. But is there a solution around these issues?
Okay. Of course, there's so many issues, right? And I think, yes, there are solutions, but there are no immediate, I would say, answer. There's no quick fix for some of these things, right? For some of them, especially when it relates to the framework itself. If you're asking a country to amend its laws,
Yeah.
that is, country that probably did not, that it took a while to get the law in the first place.
Yes.
Process for amendment is usually complicated and it is complex. And so that might take a bit of time, right? And then even at that, once it's then amended, how are you going to make sure that there is capacity for implementation? So it's one thing to amend the law and make sure that you have your basis there, but in terms of implementation, how do you increase funding? How do you build capacity? How do you ensure that there's, also awareness? So beyond just focusing on what the regulators are doing, there's also issues around awareness raising. And I think some of the challenges we face are not challenges that can be addressed by just one, either by the government or by the regulator. Many of them require a lot of stakeholders to come together within the ecosystem and find their role, and then by working together we can be able to address some of the challenges.
So talking about stakeholders coming together, who should play this role of bringing these stakeholders together, or should we all stay in our little corners and find something that we think is necessary that we should be doing?
Of course, if you're asking people to come together, then it doesn't make sense to work in silos, right? So there has to be some sort of coming together. I think it depends on what issue you're talking about. So I think we've been speaking very vaguely for a while now. So in terms of harmonization, right, of laws, I think that's one of the key challenges we face in Africa. Whereas you would have, like in Europe, for example, we have the GDPR. In Africa in particular, we do have a treaty, but it's not yet in force. And so if we had a treaty in force, then you have a level of harmonization, and then each country can then make sure that they are aligned with whatever the treaty says. So for harmonization to be a reality, it's not possible to have everybody doing their own thing, which is basically what has been happening.
Yeah.
Like each country developing their own laws. And so that requires that we have, all stakeholders come together and agree, what are we going to do with the current treaty that we have, which is the African Convention on Data Protection and Personal Data Protection, and I think cybersecurity, which is not yet in force. But there is a kind of awareness of the fact that it is kind of outdated because it's, based on earlier EU frameworks, and now we have moved forward. So how do we, I don't know if I should say the word amend, but it's not yet in force, update that treaty? That requires work at the level of the AU that developed the treaty, but also that having different stakeholders come together and play a role in updating that treaty. So that's on the level of harmonization. And I think once we have that right, so to speak, other things start to fall into place. Now, the challenge that I'm seeing is that there's a lot of parallel harmonization processes, which then complicates the issue.
Okay.
You have, as far as I know, we have, of course, there's AU Convention, but we also have the Network of African DPAs trying to harmonize. We have Span Africa doing some work about harmonization. We have PRIDA. So how do we ensure that everybody's speaking to each other? How do we ensure that we have all the right stakeholders in the room to support this process in a holistic and in a coordinated way? It's, I think, one of the things we need to do.
Well, I mean, harmonization is no doubt an extremely important issue, especially when we're looking at things like a continental digital economy, where there is freedom of movement of goods and services across borders within the continent, something that we continue to face a challenge around. Sometimes, personally, when it comes to harmonization, I have always proposed that, look, I don't think that we are at that place where we'll be able to mobilize all countries to sign the treaty, to change the laws, to have something that satisfies everybody. But there is the potential, which is what I call the low-hanging fruits, right? You have the DPAs. Most of them have collaboration powers under their laws to collaborate with other third parties. Is it possible for the DPAs to start within themselves creating this ecosystem? Because like you said, the world is leaving us by, and the processes to change these laws, we all know is extremely, if not impossible, it's extremely challenging. The times that it would take, the number of consultations that can happen. So is it possible for, let's say, even, especially when you're looking at the area of data protection and privacy, you know, for regulators to individually start thinking around cooperation agreements and the like to really facilitate some of these discussions? So if you take a place like South Africa, can they talk to Mauritius? Can they talk to Ghana? Can they talk to Kenya? Because amongst themselves, it's probably easier to recognize the similarities within their laws and to say that when it comes to movement of data or personal data within these regions, these are the modalities we expect each other to comply with, and we accept these standards, you know, to allow for movement. Is that something that you think is feasible, looking at where you're sitting?
Absolutely.
You know?
I think the important thing is the outcome. And so if the issue that we face is difficulties or a lot of variance across the region, then any initiative that is going to reduce that variance, I think, would always be welcome. That said, I think it's really also a case of what will be the modalities, and also first, before even the modalities, I think having those kind of agreements or legal frameworks, it really depends on the gap that framework is trying to cure. That I think will depend. That's what will determine its legitimacy in a way, but also its relevance to the conversation. Okay. And so if you are saying we want DPAs to come together and start to sort of agree on issues, would it be like on specific topics?
Yeah.
Or would it be revamping the entire data protection frameworks, which I imagine will come up with a lot of opposition from the legislators? They will say, but our role as a legislator is actually to make the law. So if you want to overhaul the law entirely, you can't go through the back door.
Exactly.
So maybe that kind of initiative will be on specific areas where we think are probably the most, where there's probably a lot of issues.
Yeah, so I mean, we're talking digital economy and e-commerce, right?
In particular.
And so where two countries are identifying the potential within this area, is it, something that is easily doable, for instance, for a regulator to recognize, let's say it's even sector specific. So we're looking at the fintech space, right, to allow for movement of funds during trading and other purposes. So we have the right sectors, we have the regulators and other people meeting on these issues and agreeing to certain modalities and moving on from there.
Absolutely, I think that's a great idea. But I mean, maybe because I have such belief in having like regional frameworks, overarching frameworks that people can borrow from, that I think has its place.
Yes.
Right? But then just looking from the outside and saying, okay, if two countries agree on that, that is fantastic for those two countries. But what about the others? Right? So what I would think would probably be a better option is to, that is good, but also have it as, if possible, something across the region, or at least with the regulators, with all the regulators. Try and bring, of course, some might say they don't want to be part of it, but the bigger the circle, I think the greater the potential to address what the issue or the challenges might be.
Well, I mean, it's well said. I always, having worked in Africa for some time, I always see these things as challenging. Talking to one person is difficult. How much more 10 or 20 people? and and then it's almost like we're talking to each other and different people coming together. So maybe that's what creates the challenges that we face in this space. But I don't think that we should put that at the back burner, because like you said, the potential in this space is enormous, as you had mentioned earlier, and we really need to do a lot more to facilitate, these discussions, to make sure it has to happen at some point, and the earlier we start is better.
Absolutely.
But moving on from harmonization, capacity has always been a big issue on the continent when it comes to data protection and privacy. What are your thoughts about this space? How do we build the right capacity that is required? And I'm talking about the right capacity. I mean, today, because data protection issues are important on the continent, we see a lot of people calling themselves experts, but it does not necessarily translate into the expertise that is required to allow this area to grow on the continent. So what do you think we can really do to build that capacity? I like that there is interest, but we really have to do a lot more. What do you think about this?
That's a very interesting question. I think that straddles conversations on capacity for, the entire ecosystem, from the regulators themselves, but also to the ordinary person on the street. And that, I would say, is one thing that we always end up, when we have conversations with the regulators, that's where the conversation always sort of ends. I think there are many ways of looking at it, beyond regulators and ordinary people. When we look at the ecosystem, there is also, like in the conversation earlier today, there's also enforcement. Once you have, for example, a decision, most of the time you also have to go to the courts, through the court system. Do judges also have the right capacity to be able to understand and comprehend the data protection issues and be able to apply them and, administer justice? That's on the one hand. And also, starting from the very basis, I think lawyers, for example, are they in our curriculum? Are we having lawyers being trained on data protection at the undergraduate level across the region? I'm not sure that is happening. At children in schools, I think it's imperative in this day and age to start to talk about data protection, of course, in an age-appropriate manner from when kids are young. Is that happening? I don't think enough of that is happening. So I think right across the board, there's a lot of work to be done. As Meta, there's some, of course, it's not by a long shot, sufficient, or, what we believe is going to solve or cure the problem. But there's a few things that we're trying to do to build capacity. So, for example, we collaborate with academic institutions, for example, to run certificate courses in data protection. We also had the first moot court competition that we supported. Okay. And the idea there is really to start to build understanding. This was for lawyers in undergraduate study in a particular country, to sort of understand what the issues are. And that way you build capacity. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but I wanted to just emphasize that it's something that is across the board. So we often talk about regulators, needing capacity, and people who are called themselves experts needing capacity. But I think the issue is broader than that. We have to look at the entire ecosystem, right from when kids are young to, students, to different professionals, because, like I was talking about lawyers now, it doesn't apply only to lawyers. You need to have the right kind of certification systems as well within the ecosystem to ensure that people are properly trained to understand the issues, of course, within the African context, and be able to also then spread that knowledge and spread the expertise across the region. So I think it's a multifaceted issue.
I agree indeed. But the question that I'm going to throw back at you, which is also linked to the next issue that I want us to talk about, is funding. Capacity building is very expensive.
It is.
And data protection expertise is very expensive. And we know that one of the biggest challenges that regulators face in this space is always resources, right? So even the resources to bring everybody together can be a challenge within a country. The resources to bring in experts to come and help with the capacity building can be a challenge. Are there, some other, apart from, organizations like yours that do quite a bit, and I know that comes with a lot of financial resource backing those activities. How else can we, within the continent, mobilize, these resources to ensure that we're able to build the right ecosystem when it comes to capacity?
To be honest, I would say the starting point is always that governments should prioritize data protection. I know there's a whole lot of issues that each country is grappling with, and resources are scarce, but I think it should really start with providing the necessary adequate funding for regulators and, data protection authorities to be able to, not necessarily solve the entire problem, but at least to be able to support them as they build capacity for themselves, but also for others in the ecosystem. For me, that's a starting point. There is no way, yes, like I said, we know governments have different things they need to do, there's scarcity, but there has to be some, initial, allocation. Because if you don't believe an issue is important enough to warrant support and funding, then it's hard to find or to expect others to carry that burden. So for me, that's a starting point, right? And then the issue then goes to how do we then support whatever initial, support has been provided by the government. Yes, of course, the private sector is there to support, but like you said, it's a capital intensive endeavor. So the private sector can do its own part to do that. I think one has to be creative with this kind of initiatives. How do we make use of opportunities that exist to have capacity building? So beyond saying you want to have a session or capacity building exclusively on a particular issue, how do you do that maybe on the back of other things that are happening? For example, you have maybe a conference that is planned already. How do you piggyback on that kind of conference and have some form of capacity building to support, whoever? I think, like I said, once you have scarcity, you need to be creative. So my thing will be to make use of every opportunity that is possible to build capacity in any way that is possible. That would be my take on that.
So, Dr. Shyllon, thank you very much for joining us today. We've spoken about harmonization, we've spoken about capacity building, we've spoken about funding the data protection and privacy sector in Africa. Are there any other parting words for us?
I think I will say that data protection in Africa is everyone's problem and requires everyone's input. I think oftentimes there's a lot of criticism about the lack of progress. But like I said before, I think it's a nascent space for us in the region. And whilst not saying we must move at snail speed, that must always be at the back of our mind to say that others have gone ahead of us, and we should, like I said, learn from them, but not try and copy them completely. And yes, we need to have all the players in the ecosystem to contribute their quota to ensuring the advancement of data protection in Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ololade. As you heard from her, data protection is everybody's business, and we need to garner all the resources and collaborations that we can to make sure that we move this important discussion forward. Join us another time on the Digital Rights Africa podcast.